Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is David Bell, the Vice-Chancellor here at the University of Reading, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this very special event. Just before I do the proper introduction, I would like you to note that we are both filming and live streaming tonight's event. If you get any worries or anxieties about that, please let us know, but if you ask a question, you will be featured in the film and online. As I said, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to this very special occasion. We've got some words coming up from our founding Vice-Chancellor, W.M. Childs. And I believe that these words have a special resonance as we launch the University of Reading's first fundraising and volunteering campaign, the Imagine campaign. Since we were granted our Royal Charter in 1926, and indeed from our beginnings in the middle to late 19th century, we have always been a pioneering institution at the centre of research and innovation, challenging conventions. But we don't just have a rich heritage, which we've been celebrating this year. The work that we do today is more important than it's ever been. In the coming decades, we will face challenges so profound that they will alter the relationships we have with one another and with our environment. These challenges are complex, and tackling them requires approaches that transcend the traditional boundaries of academic disciplines. This university is a place where great things are possible, where innovative ideas come to life, gather momentum, and change what we think and do. In addition, this university is a place where great teaching and learning happens. So our campaign is about working together to imagine and then realise solutions to a better future. We have identified our strategic research and teaching priorities and defined initiatives that will change our world. These fall under 7 themes for the campaign: environment, food, health, heritage and creativity, prosperity and resilience, shaping the future of business, and educating for 21st century lives. And we hope that support for Imagine will enable us to turn philanthropy into major impact across these areas and many more besides. Because we believe that together we can attain some of the most significant endeavours envisioned by the university. We have set a campaign goal of 150 million, at the same time as inspiring our supporters to give over 60,000 hours of their time. Tonight is the public declaration of that aspiration. I'm also delighted tonight to announce that Lord Crisp, Nigel Crisp, has agreed to be the chair of the Imagine campaign. First and foremost, Nigel is one of us, being a member of the University Council, our supreme governing body. Nigel brings a wealth of experience to this role. He is an independent crossbench member of the House of Lords, and his interests focus primarily on international development and global health. Nigel also chairs Sightsavers International and is an advisor to numerous healthcare and development organisations. He is also an honorary professor at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, amongst many other appointments. I count Nigel as a friend and colleague from my days in Whitehall, and we are deeply honoured to have him as our campaign chair. Nigel, you're very welcome, and I know you would like to say one or two words. Nigel Crisp.
Well, thank much indeed, Mr. Vice-Chancellor, sir. I only want to say two things. I mean, the first one is I was greatly flattered to be asked to do this, to take on this role, and delighted to do so, in support of the great vision that you have just set out. And really that links with my second point, which is that I'm a relatively new member of the Council, although I'm a local person, so I know a bit about the University of Reading, but I have been extremely impressed in the last year or two in what I've learnt about some of the things that are going on here that probably aren't known as widely as they should be, either locally or nationally or internationally. And I think this great campaign that you're launching, David, gives the opportunity to make all of these things much better known, to get more support for them, and indeed to get support for the extraordinary things that are going to be done in the future. So thank you very much.
Throughout our 90-year history, we have demonstrated our ability to develop ideas that can shape the future. But what will that future look like? And what will our impact be over the coming 90 years, as this year we celebrate our 90th anniversary? Our panellists this evening will consider that question. We have drawn together some of our leading academics to imagine what the possibilities may be. To lead and chair this expert discussion, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Richard Sambrook. Again, Richard is one of us, an alumnus of the university, graduating in English. He is currently Professor of Journalism and Director of the Centre for Journalism at Cardiff University. Previously, he was Director of Global News at the BBC, where he worked as a journalist for 30 years, and also as a producer, editor and manager. Richard, welcome back to Reading, and over to you. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Richard Sambrook.
David, thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to be back here in Reading to see how far and how much the university has developed since my time here many years ago, and also the vigour and the robustness with which you're looking to the future and the future contribution that the university can make, as epitomised by this campaign and indeed this evening's event. Now, just a couple of words from me about how this is going to work. We have a great panel that I'm going to in a moment. They're each going to speak for 5 or 6 minutes on this key topic, which we're going to outline the question to dream and imagine what will be the impact of Reading University's research in the coming 90 years. So they're each going to talk about that for a few minutes, and we'll have a little bit of discussion between the panellists before opening it up to all of you. We've got just over an hour in all. So I know it's going to be a really fascinating debate that we're going to have. Just to introduce the panellists, from your right, we start off with Dr. Patrick Lewis, who's Associate Professor in Cellular and Molecular Neuroscience. Patrick has been working on neurodegenerative diseases for over 10 years, first at the Mayo Clinic in Florida, where he studied the molecular basis of Alzheimer's disease, and he then went on to research Parkinson's disease at the National Institute on Aging in Bethesda in the USA. And in 2013, he moved here to the University of Reading to continue his work on the protein LRRK2. Next to Patrick, we have Professor Doug Sadie, who is Director of the Centre for Intelligent Neuroscience and Genetics. No, we don't. We should have. It's at the other end, sorry. So Professor Doug Sadie will be next. Doug is also the co-chair of the SH4 panel of the European Research Council, which helps to set the direction of research agendas and funding in cognitive neuroscience across the EU. He's taught and built substantial research agendas in the UK, the US, Netherlands, Germany and Australia. Dr. Lisa Peirce is Associate Professor in Film, Theatre and Television. She is next to Patrick. Lisa is the author of Digital Imaging in Popular Cinema and Contemporary Action Cinema, and has published widely on genre cinema, digital aesthetics and the relationships between film, style and the politics of conflict representation in mainstream cinema. And then next to Lisa, we have Dr. Bernd Vogel, who's Director of the Henley Centre for Engaging Leadership, and he's Associate Professor of Leadership and Organisational Behaviour. Bernd's earlier roles include lecturer at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland and visiting scholar at the University of Southern California's Marshall School of Business. Bernd's research focuses on engaging leadership, mobilising and maintaining energy in organisations and senior management teams, CEO decision-making and organisational change. And then finally we have, between Bernd and Doug, we have Professor Ellie Highwood, who's Professor of Meteorology. Ellie studied physics at Manchester and then came to Reading in 1993 to do a PhD in meteorology, going on to serve as Head of Department of Meteorology from 2012 to 2015. Ellie's research focuses on understanding the impact of particles in the atmosphere and their effect on climate and climate change. Someone who got caught in one of the downpours early today, I'm glad that we're going to be getting to the heart of extreme weather. She's also Vice President of the Royal Meteorological Society and will serve as President from October this year for a 2-year term. We're very pleased to welcome Ellie to the panel. She stepped in at the last moment. So each of them I'm going to ask to give a short outline of their response to that key question: to dream and imagine the impact of our research in the coming 90 years. And I'd like to start off by inviting Patrick to talk.
Thank you very much indeed. So when I was first asked to imagine what my area of research would look like in 90 years, my immediate thought was a wonderful quotation which has been attributed to Yogi Berra, the baseball player, and also to Niels Bohr, the Nobel laureate physicist, which briefly states that making predictions is very tough, especially about the future. And I think actually, thinking back to 1926 and the area which, as you've heard, that I work in terms of neurodegeneration, and in particular I work on the genetics of neurodegeneration and understanding how our DNA can influence the risk of developing Parkinson's, Alzheimer's and so on. Thinking back to 1926 and what we knew then, somebody working in my field in 1926 really would have been overwhelmed by what we understand now. In 1926, we had no idea as to what DNA was doing. We had no structure for DNA. We certainly didn't have any idea that DNA was encoding so much about what makes us human and also determines our risk for diseases. And so looking forward into the future 90 years, I think, is a fun task to approach. One thing I think we can be a bit more certain on in the field of neurodegeneration is in the shorter term future. So if I look 10 years ahead, maybe 15 years ahead, I think I can be pretty confident in saying that we will have drugs that can treat neurodegeneration, in particular dementia, which, as many of you will have heard with news reports over the past few years, is one of the biggest challenges that our health service and, in fact, in society in general that we face. There's somewhere around 800,000 people in the UK who suffer from dementia at the moment, and those numbers are only going to increase. And at the moment, we don't have any disease-modifying therapies. Now, I can say, I think, with some confidence that in 10 to 15 years' time, we will have some form of therapy, probably a combination of therapies that may slow down the progression of diseases like dementia and like Parkinson's disease. I don't think that we will have a cure. I don't think we will have something which will stop these diseases in their tracks. But I do think that we will have therapies that will make a difference to the people who, at the moment, are developing the disease. And actually, even more than that, people who may go on to develop the disease. And for me, this is where the greatest hope lies in neurodegeneration. That we'll be able to identify people who may be 10 years before they're going to develop the disease, and give them a combination of drugs. Probably these will be small molecules. There may be some kind of genetic therapies involved as well. And what we will be able to do is actually either prevent the onset of disease, perhaps making it occur 5 to 10 years after it would normally have occurred, or slow down the rate at which the disease progresses, giving people much more quality of life during their twilight years. So I think in the shorter term, over the next 10, 15 years, I think I can be quite confident in saying that we are going to have some kind of disease-modifying therapies in neurodegeneration. Over the longer term, I think it's much, much more difficult to forecast where genetics and neuroscience, and molecular neuroscience, which is my own area, where that is going to go. One of the things I think which is important to remember is exactly how complex the area of science that neuroscience is based around is, and especially how genetics influences that. In every cell in your body, you've got about 3 billion base pairs of DNA. And these are basically the template that defines how your cells behave and what they do. Now, we've started to understand that, but we really don't understand everything about our DNA, everything about our genes and how they determine things like our behavior and our risk for disease. Now, coupled to that, we're looking at an incredibly complex organ. The brain has somewhere around 80 billion brain cells, all of which interact in a huge number of ways. And Doug will be talking a little bit later about how we understand these at a systems level, using neuroimaging techniques to understand how the brain functions as a whole. And I think what I think is going to happen over the next 20 or 30 or 40 years is that the work that I do, which is looking at individual genes and looking at individual brain cells, seeing how they behave and seeing what causes them to die, I think that research will move up into closer and closer to the work that Doug is working on, looking at how the brain functions as a whole. And at some point, maybe in the next 90 years, the research that we're doing will meet in the middle somewhere. And we will actually have a much better concept of things like consciousness, what allows us to think and to dream. What is it about our brain and the way it works that allows us to do that? And I think more broadly, and I think with the other members of the panel involved in fascinating areas of research in society and in the environment, actually we'll begin to have a better idea how genetics and the way our body works factors into things like leadership. Do our genes influence the way we behave in society and organize ourselves in groups, how we present ourselves in the media, and so on and so forth? So I think there's a huge amount of potential that's only just started to be released, and it's going to be fascinating to see how the next 90 years progress. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Let's move on to Doug, because your two fields speak to each other.
Well, thanks, Patrick. It's nice to have this opportunity to sort of dream and conjecture. I will pick up what Patrick was saying. It is exactly correct that there's over the next 90 years, what we're going to see is this kind of convergence in the middle, from people working at the molecular and cellular level, trying to understand brain mechanisms and brain processes, and people working at the domain of cognitive behavior and how that is manifested in the brain. The work that we've been focusing on in SYN has been really looking at decoding the architecture of the brain, the kinds of neural systems which allow us to do things like make decisions, to speak and understand language, to have memories, to carry out a multifarious range of things that we do on a day-to-day basis. One of the interesting things, I think, in terms of short-term future impact that we can talk about is the results that we have now in our hands. So we know quite a bit about systems and about processes, and we know certain things that actually have ameliorative impact for a variety of degenerative conditions. So I'll give you one example. We have a large grant funded by the ERC called Athene, which looks at multilingualism across Europe. Associated with that is a researcher in Edinburgh by the name of Thomas Bach, who looked at multilingualism, looked at speakers of multiple languages in India, and looked at the etiology of basically Alzheimer's disease, degenerative brain processes. And he did this huge study, and he found that if you were a regular speaker of more than one language, you have 5 additional years of asymptomatic behavior. So you're not prevented from getting Alzheimer's disease, but actually you're asymptomatic for 5 extra years. Now that's a staggering result, right? It suggests that in fact certain conditions, certain behaviors on our part can actually put off some of these symptoms. Now we're working hard at trying to understand that. We have recently a paper out by Christos Pliatzakis in our group who's shown that speaking more than one language actually changes the structure of the white matter in your brain. And it's probably the case that the reason that you're asymptomatic and the conditions that Thomas Bach presented is because in fact you have extra brain systems to rely on. It's not that you don't have the disease, it's that you have a little more reserve. And this links up actually to something that we've worked on with the business school. We've looked at a range of CEOs. We've had over 20 CEOs come in and go in the scanner and carry out a task looking at decision making. And what we found would make a great headline. It looks like CEOs perform like 20-year-olds in certain types of gambling decision-making tasks. But that's not the headline. You haven't seen it, and it's because actually, if you look at it, so we looked at the 20-year-olds, we looked at age-match controls, and we looked at the CEOs, and the CEOs' brains look exactly like their age-match controls, right? They show ventricle shrinking. They don't have frontal poles, just like all the rest of us here, right? So they show aging effects. So they don't have younger brains. What they do is solve the problem using a different set of systems. So the age-match controls and the young people use the same brain system. Okay, the young people are good at it. The age-match controls are bad at it. Why? Well, because the brain system they're using is actually not there. They don't have frontal poles. They don't have certain parts of the system, so they don't do so very well. The CEOs are solving the same task. They're doing much better. They're not relying on the same system. Now, I suspect that this business about Alzheimer's disease being ameliorated by speaking more than one language and CEOs doing better on decision-making tasks are at root the same phenomena. That is, that it's possible to use the brain in different ways such that we can carry on performing at a higher level for longer. Now, I think that, like we heard before, this is something where we're going to see results within the next 40 years. In the next 90 years, we're going to see something very different. We are now at the early stages of brain-computer interface. We can actually do it, right? We put wires in people's brains. We can get people to control prosthetic arms using their minds. We can do all that stuff. A lot of the initial science fiction-y things is really an engineering challenge, not a science challenge. But what the real science is understanding consciousness. And to do that, we actually have to understand what the brain is actually doing. And some of the work that we've been doing at Reading, which is computational modeling, molecular research, points us in the direction of an answer to what it is that the brain is doing. The brain, we know, is not a computer. We know it's not a lot of things. It's not a hydraulic system. It's not all sorts of theories. What we don't have an answer to is what it is actually doing, such that it allows us to be us. The answer to that is going to be this fusion. It's going to come from the fusion of researchers who are working across a wide range of domains. And it's also going to come from dreaming, right? Scientists aren't engineers, right? We're not actually doing this sort of mundane stuff. We actually get very excited about crazy ideas. We need to have people who make crazy ideas up so that some scientist somewhere will go, yeah, I wonder if that could actually work. And then we end up with these things, which actually act like memory systems for us. Right? And you can imagine, since I can't actually use this properly, but my daughter can, that by the time 90 years from now, there's going to be something else, right? That we can't imagine that our grandchildren won't be able to use properly, but our great-great-grandchildren will. Thank you.
Doug, thank you very much. There's so much there that I know we're going to come back to in a few minutes' time. But next, a slight shift of tack, or maybe not, we'll see. Dr. Lisa Peirce.
Thanks very much. So I'm going to talk about the present in order to look forward to the future. We live in an era of conflict, the so-called war on terror, civil war, revolution, and mass forced migration. But it's often through moving images that we understand these conflicts and their consequences, via rolling news coverage, Twitter and Tumblr feeds, WhatsApp, Facebook posts, and also the traditional film and television mediums. And if I think about my own research, I analyse how these moving images work, how they frame real-world situations, what they emphasise, and crucially, what they also leave out of the picture. So I'm interested in the ways in which moving image production really connect to the way in which societies and different cultures can speak to each other, or indeed not. So, for example, if we look at Hollywood's depiction of the war on terror, we see particular trends that are likely to shape public perception in what I politely call unhelpful ways, but which have their roots, I think, in long-standing and rather old-fashioned, in fact prejudicial really, ideas about the relationship between East, in inverted commas, and West. So in a series of US films set in Iraq and Afghanistan and also on US soil, so I'm thinking here of The Hurt Locker or American Sniper or Stop Loss, the figure depicted as the victim of military action in these films is the US soldier. So this move allows these films to perhaps productively question the efficacy of military action, but it also erases the suffering of those people who are actually living on the ground in these regions, the civilians who are there. Secondly, in these films, we can see that, and I'm also thinking here about films like Zero Dark 30 and the TV show Homeland that look at counter-terrorism specifically. Almost all of the civilian characters in these Middle East regions that are depicted either are terrorists or may become terrorists, or may just, they're just about to sort of spring forth in that way. And in February, actually, President Obama picked up on this point, that you only see, for example, Muslim characters in counter-terrorist narratives, and that's a little bit unhelpful. But thirdly, in these films, the regions themselves are actually being depicted in very particular kinds of ways. They're only being depicted in terms of checkpoints, or protests, or roadside bombs. So they're being created as kind of regions of threat. And I'm thinking here that what we could see instead are shops, perhaps petrol stations, meeting places, schools, and so on. So what's missing from the Hollywood picture then is any sense of non-violent civilian lived experiences, making cups of tea, buying bread, studying, playing with their children. So those very experiences that might speak across cultural difference or across geographic borders. We might say that these are fictions, they're just entertainment, but they do have significant reach. So American Sniper is now the largest grossing war movie of all time. So this is something we need to pay attention to, I think. Such fictions hark back to 19th century colonialist ideas about the Middle East as exotic, mysterious, dangerous, a collection of distant territories to be occupied, not peoples and cultures to be respected and valued. And all too often, we find that these popular culture myths and fictions start to seep into the language that we use in public debate, on the fronts of newspapers, for example, or on the lips of politicians in US and Europe. So about the war on terror, about foreign policy, about ISIS, and about refugees. As political scientist Michael Shapiro has noted, getting into the habit of characterising peoples and lands in particular ways has consequences for community cohesion, for cross-cultural understanding and empathy, for how different lives are valued or dismissed. So if our research can continue to help shine a light on these moving images and their power to shape public and policy debate, then we also have the power to move that debate on in a more self-aware, more constructive manner that can help build consensus rather than pushing people apart. But what really gives me hope for the next 90 years is the filmmaking practices that are gaining traction in the Middle East, which also demand recognition and study. So years of conflict in places like Yemen, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria have dismantled traditional infrastructures for film production and distribution. But in their place is a flowering of filmmaking and film exhibition using other means. They're being filmed on mobile phones and cheap video cameras. They're being shown in pop-up cinemas, in empty shopping malls and other repurposed spaces, and they're being shared with a wider audience on Facebook and YouTube. So technology is at the heart of this movement, but so are people, citizen activists and citizen filmmakers. What they capture is the antidote to lazy Western caricatures. Their lives, lived in ordinary and everyday circumstances, as well as the extraordinary and the traumatic. We know that people are picking up cameras to document their revolutions, their human rights abuses that they're suffering, the destruction wrought by conflict, but they're also capturing, through filmmaking collectives or under their own steam, their own experiences. They're creating art, they're creating images through which they can reflect on life, identity, the traumatic and the life-affirming. And these are images that can be shared across borders, as I say. It's these kinds of images which give me hope for the future. It's these kinds of images that I think we have a responsibility within universities to promote, to try and facilitate, to share, to curate, to study. It's these kinds of images through which people can connect across cultural, geographic or religious divides, finding commonalities as well as learning about differences. It's these images that shared widely can enhance cross-cultural understanding and social cohesion. And so this meeting of people and technology, this meeting of social media to share those kinds of films and the people who make them, is one of the things that I think are going to shape both the cultural production of the next 90 years, but also the ways in which we talk about conflict and post-conflict settings and bringing people back together in those settings. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It seems to me already there's a little bit of a common theme coming through about the role of technology, the impact of technology socially and politically, but also the role of imagination in determining the future as well. So those are perhaps a couple of the things you might pick up in a moment. But next, let's hear from Dr. Bernpool.
Well, thank you very much, and I hope you share that this is actually also learning, interesting learning for everyone. We didn't need to talk as a business school about CEOs and gambling. That's quite helpful. And as a non-native speaker like myself, there's actually also hope, in some area. And the Middle East people are the new Germans in Hollywood. So there's something like that, but there is but we come back to that. I think for the Henley Business School in our leadership center, and thinking 90 years forward, for us means also looking back 70 years because we celebrate our 70 years of the Henley Business School, and you could track quite nicely the difference that has hopefully made in other people's lives and in society, and we look at that very carefully. I'm very positive about that. Can we transport that into the future and create similar positive impact? One of the, if you think, imagine from today into the future, I think one of the themes that I'm particularly interested in is challenging the notion of leadership. What is leadership today and going forward? I think we just don't know really. And we see some of the patterns that we've heard, we've listened to earlier. And so what do we mean when we talk about that today and in the future? And we had a session today in our MA in leadership, and we asked about purposes of businesses. A very, very simple question, and people are struggling to answer what the purpose is. And so with these 90 years, they actually asked us ourselves to say, well, where are we going for the next 90 years, and why are we doing this? And I think that's a challenge that will be starting today, will be older, will be with us all the time in the years to come. And probably don't even know how deep this question will lead us. We'll come back to that. And then it's interesting within that, there's a stretch between looking at neuroscience of leaders, but also the systematic question, the system questions around leadership, the cultures, the values that we have, and how that's defined, and what role business does play. And I found really interesting when you said, so-called Western, Eastern, and African perspective, because leadership research is dominated by a Western view. That's how we look at the world, and it changes now. And we did a study, what does leadership mean in South Africa? Because we have a campus down there, completely different context. Let's not go there and tell, but learn, with them. And I think that's kind of the way forward, also through obviously the Malaysia campus, a possibility to really get a cross-cultural, intercultural understanding there. I think that's where we go. And then again, between the individual and how we shape systems around managing and leading as a process. The other question that comes along, and that was spoken about, is the question of digital. Our work life changed today. We don't even know how they change. And how do we navigate as managers and leaders in digital environments? And are we willing to admit that we don't know, actually, for many managers today? And we start a project with the FTSE 500 organization exactly that. And what does it mean? And I think we can't ask the question for the next 90 years because we don't know how this digital revolution or renaissance actually kind of will end up. And I think that would be a theme. And the third theme around business responsibility is the question of ethics. I think you casually gave away we can put wires and brains. Sounds pretty impressive, but there's a huge question behind that. And business leaders, societal leaders probably need to ask hard and think about, how do we do that? Why are we doing that? How's it helping society? And we hope as a business school that we can facilitate the discussion and the research behind these questions, because these are big, impactful questions that we probably face. And then the final piece, how can we translate that, change our way, probably about educating in the business and leadership environment. When do we start with leadership kind of education and information? Is it at school level, and we think about that at the business school? Does it ever stop? Those are a bit more seasoned here. Is it a lifelong journey, and how do we do that and nurture that over time? I think leadership development in the next 90 years will completely look different and as we thought. And as a business school, these are some of the themes that we probably like to imagine when we look back in 90 years that we could have helped with, basically beyond the remit of the university and all the societal impact.
Well, thank you very much, and you raised some huge issues there about ethics, which is going to touch on every area of specialism, I'm sure, in the debate later, and the role of what is leadership in the environment in which we find ourselves. But finally, let's go to Professor Ellie Highwood.
Good evening. Possibly one of the worst things than being caught in an extreme weather downpour is if you're a professor of meteorology caught in an extreme weather downpour. Because that's rather embarrassing to explain. And so please forgive my voice, because as a result of getting caught in a downpour last week, I am somewhat struggling, but we'll see how we go. So my area is actually more to do with climate change than day-to-day weather, and one of the advantages of forecasting climate is, of course, that nobody can tell you that your forecast is wrong, at least probably not in my lifetime. We are actually very used to considering 90-year timescales or even longer. But recently, because of the interplay between politics, economics, societal change, and climate change, it means that we're increasingly having to focus our attention not just on the 90 to 100-year timescales, but also on what's going to happen over the next few decades. That's where people are planning for in a whole host of fields. And I think that is something that we're going to spend a lot more time doing over the next 90 years. We'll be looking a long way in advance, but also on the next few decades. Of course, the major physics underlying climate change has been known for a lot longer than 90 years. So in 1895, Arrhenius presented a paper to the Stockholm Physical Society entitled On the Influence of Carbonic Acid, which is another name for carbon dioxide, in the air upon the temperature of the ground. In fact, he also performed calculations that are known and loved by our undergraduates and our master's students at the moment in meteorology and climate change by taking a simple physical and maths-based model, doubling the concentration of CO2, and seeing what the impact on the temperature would be. However, he underestimated the point at which we would reach a doubling of CO2. Little did he know, in fact, how quickly the CO2 concentration would rise in the atmosphere, and that by January 2016, climate change would be ranked as the number 2 threat to humanity by the World Economic Forum, behind mass migration, which of course is not necessarily completely separate from climate change. He probably also didn't imagine that climate change's close cousin, air pollution, would be held responsible for 3.7 million premature deaths worldwide by 2012, in 2012 per year. So, over the last 90 years, although we've known about carbon dioxide and its impact on radiation, the complexities of how the climate system actually responds to those changes have become increasingly apparent, and we're becoming increasingly challenged about that. The role of other atmospheric components, for example, ozone, soot, which is one of the things that I work on, so tiny particles in the atmosphere that are actually in the centre of every single one of those raindrops that hit you on the head earlier. Without those, we wouldn't be able to form raindrops. So just bear in mind that you're getting showered with soot or desert dust, or you just can't see it. Unless it comes in your cars, in which case you will be able to see it. Elsewhere, And here at Reading, computers and satellite instruments become developed as an array of tools for teasing apart the interactions between additional parts of the climate system, so not just thinking about the atmosphere. We've got the ocean, the cryosphere, the land surface. And as I said before, one of the things we find most challenging is then integrating that with economic and social changes. I would note, though, that there's still much to be learned from historical records of climate change. So we've recently celebrated 100 years of weather observations in Reading. There is a book available, I can give you the details later. Both from our observatory down on London Road site and now here on White Knights campus. And I imagine we'll continue to make those valuable measurements, some of which will still be made in a very similar way to where they were 90 years ago for continuity for the next 90 years. New technology, however, does allow us to make increasingly complex measurements, so we can now send tiny sensors up on weather balloons, or we can convince commercial aircraft that the things we need to measure the gas concentration in the atmosphere are now so light and cheap that they can run them on their commercial flights. And that, although giving us very particular paths of information from one hub to another, is helping to improve knowledge of what we've got. We're also digitising observations from old ship logs and discovering whole new observations of the aftermath of volcanic eruptions and the impact on climate. What we know already from climate research at Reading and from our many national and international collaborations about the next 90 years lead me to expect a world, perhaps slightly stronger than imagined, but expect a world where the wet get wetter whilst the dry get drier. And by that I mean those areas of the world that currently get a lot of rainfall will probably get even more rainfall, and those areas that don't will become drier. Along with an increase in intensity and frequency of our beloved extreme rain events over mid-latitude lands and tropical rain belts. So that obviously has implications for agriculture, for flooding, and for drought, and for water resources, food security, energy security. We also expect that the Atlantic circulation will slow down, which actually probably won't mean that we cool down here, because by the end of the 21st century, in 90 years' time, the warming due to CO2 will have overtaken any local effects of that. And if my dreams, which I'll get to in a moment, don't become reality, then by the end of the 21st century, we'll probably have a nearly ice-free Arctic in the summer. So commercial shipping routes will open up across the Arctic, which will be a major game changer in the commercial world. And so to dreams. Well, firstly, with my personal research, I'm travelling to Stockholm, Arrhenius' birthplace, next weekend. And whenever I fly, I always look at the clouds and think they're beautiful, but they are oh so frustrating. They are one of the things that it's really hard for us to deal with, to understand, because they change so quickly, so many different types in so many different ways. So understanding the physics of how those cloud changes work and how they affect climate change is a really big issue. Then I hope that the recent Paris Climate Agreement follows the way of the Montreal Protocol. So the first agreement is never enough, you need 5 or 6 amendments after that, driven by science done at Reading and elsewhere, as well as consumer and public opinion enlightened by enhanced climate science communication, will reduce our greenhouse gas emissions in order to limit the impacts of climate change. My second dream is that we have robust, resilient and equitable supplies of food, water and energy, and the ability to deal with changes in patterns of disease. And that thirdly, where the inertia of the climate system means we're already committed to some destructive impacts of climate change, individuals, communities and nations, such as across the universities, have worked together to protect humanity and biodiversity and to minimise conflict. Climate change, justice and social equity is a really key research area, and that's one where Reading is well poised to develop and lead. And actually I kind of hope my projections don't come true.
Thank you very, very much indeed. And what's clear from, thank all of you for your presentations there, what's clear is that Reading University is very closely engaged in some of the big issues and challenges that we face in the future, be they scientific, be they social, cultural, or in business or in politics. I wonder if I could just explore 2 or 3 of the themes that came out amongst the panel, and then we'll open it up and leave plenty of time for questions from all of you as well. And I want to start by picking up on something that Doug said, which is about the role of imagination. This event is called Imagine. How important, each of you, is the role of imagination, of being able to project forward, of being able to envision possibilities in order to drive forward the kind of areas of expertise that we're all involved in? Because people wouldn't automatically think, perhaps in science, that imagination plays a part. They think it's all about research and microscopes. But you raised that question. Do you want to...
Sure. Well, I mean, imagination is actually core. If you scratch most researchers, you'll find someone who thinks that they're a sort of an artist. To do any of the kind of experiments that we construct requires real leaps of creative fancy. We're trying to imagine conditions which can be easily manipulated, but which represent in some kind of useful way some complex process. That's just crazy, right? I mean, and in fact, we're called on it all the time. People say, well, you did this experiment. That's, why do you say that's got anything to do with decision making? All they were doing was turning cards over. What's that got to do with decision making? Well, the fact is that what you have to try and do for any of these things is reduce issues and questions down to the very simplest possible way of representing them. And sometimes it's totally misleading, but that's the risk, right? But to make even the first step requires that you actually fantasize about how things might work.
Is that true for you? With molecular level?
So I think that's absolutely right. But actually, I think that the biggest leaps forward in any area of science really depend upon the most creative solutions. And when you think about the kind of challenges that I'm looking at a molecular level, Doug's looking at a systems level, looking at climate change, how businesses operate, how creative industries work, actually the answers to those big challenges have to be created. Otherwise you have this sort of incremental advance, which actually doesn't really change the status quo. So those big changes are almost always the most creative ones. And I think one of the most interesting things from a bench scientist's point of view is trying to understand how approaches from the creative industries and from business, how we can use approaches which are being developed by them to answer very, very different questions and apply those to our own areas to accelerate the rate of advance. So I think creativity is central.
Lisa, you of course talked about obviously the opportunities for in entertainment and so on, a lot of imagination there, but there are downsides as well.
Yeah.
So I mean, culturally, there can be a cultural impact which is negative as well as positives of imagination.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a responsibility to document the negatives of cultural representation and its imaginings of our world and our peoples and our cultures. But we also are living in a period of time where we have to be creative in the way that we design our projects for the future. So, I mean, I've just imagined a future for a particular kind of filmmaking, but we're also talking about designing projects which affect social change in some way. That connect different kinds of people, so not just academics working in a library or studying a text in a particular kind of way, but also the people who are affected by those kind of cultural productions. So we need to talk to NGOs, we need to talk to people working on the ground in some of these conflict areas to really bring the change that's possible using this kind of cultural production. So again, in a similar kind of way to Doug and Patrick, we're designing projects where you have to take that kind of outside of the box approach, I think.
Well, you raised the question of what is leadership today, and of course, business leaders like all us face extraordinary change that's going on, driven by technologies, where there's many other volatile elements as well. So is imagination crucial to the kind of work you're doing, trying to deliver and develop leadership for the future? How good a guide is leadership in the past to what's going to be needed to confront the challenges that business leaders are going to face in the next 90 years?
I think, like in every research, that imagination or curiosity is first of all a driver for what we're doing. If you're not curious, you're probably not in the right business if you want. And that's probably the same around leadership, where you ask big questions, long-term questions about why we are doing our business as organizations, and at the same time then thinking about how do we get there. And one of my previous colleagues, he always said the vision is a dream with a say-by date. So you imagine to where you're going, and then you try to various milestones to get there. Otherwise, we wouldn't have an iPhone, or we wouldn't sit in this environment, because we would just kind of continue what we're doing, with the risk in that as well. And I think, us as audience, look sometimes at leaders, being it academic leaders, business society, because they ask big questions, we find them odd, because they disconnect from where we are. And that's then a real question: how do we make this transition from the today into the future, so that the odd becomes the possibility?
That is the role of leadership, though, isn't it?
Absolutely.
To connect where you're going with where
Yes.
you are today. Ali, any thoughts in your area about the importance of being able to project forwards and envision?
Well, in similar ways to Doug and Patrick, we design experiments too, so we have to be very creative. But actually, thinking about what solutions might be needed to deal with the challenges coming from climate change and other environmental issues requires us to imagine a whole set of different possible worlds, because there is so much variation in where we could go in terms of population growth, in terms of technology development, that we have to imagine many different potential ways that we could go forward. So we are constantly imagining different scenarios, and in fact our major international modelling of climate projections, we don't just take one possible world going forward, we take 4 or 5 different possible worlds going forward, and we look at all of those, and that gives us a range of possibilities.
Let me just explore one other area before I open it up, and that's about obviously the use of technology. So again, you talked about the possibilities of bringing technology and the brain together, and what that would help us to understand in a very different way. Lizzie, you talked about the cultural impact of social media that we all experience every day, and we carry these things around in our pockets and so on. But of course raise the ethical questions, and it always strikes me that one of the things about technology, and we often get caught up in talking about the extraordinary opportunities and advantages, but it does raise quite big ethical issues sometimes, isn't it? And in my area of media, which is increasingly determined by algorithms, it's not just the media, it's the financial markets and much else as well, they are unaccountable in many ways. So there are big ethical questions around technology. It's obviously driving us forward in an extraordinary and wonderful, fascinating way, but it does raise very big issues for us all as well, isn't it? Who would like to pick up on that?
I think one of the, although I'm not a geneticist myself, I work very closely with geneticists, and one of the things that I find, in a way quite scary actually, is the rate at which technology goes beyond where society expects it to be. So if you'd have asked me 10 years ago that you'd be able to go to Superdrug and get a readout of your genome in 2016, I would have thought you were crazy. But you can. You can go into Superdrug, you can purchase a kit for £125, send off a sample of your saliva to California, and then a couple of weeks later you get a readout of your genome. And the information that's encoded in all of that, the information that will come back to you, contains many things that actually you might not want to know. And the ethical and social impact of being able to read the template that makes us who we are, actually I don't think we, as a society, we haven't really talked about that. And you see, going back to the sort of the portrayal of science in films, that there are films that cover this, but people would watch them and see them as almost sort of as horror films in many ways. But actually, in a way, we're already at a point where we can look for all of that. So I think that the rate at which technology accelerates ahead of our expectations is something that I'm very aware of.
And what can we do about that in order to try and make sure that we can keep pace with where technology is taking us in terms of how we manage it and interact with it politically and socially and culturally and ethically and so on?
I mean, I think we need to be self-aware. We need to be aware about the myths around technology that circulate in our culture. So if we take the Arab Spring, for example, some people called the Egyptian Arab Spring movement a Facebook revolution. In Tunisia, it was a Twitter revolution. I mean, these are Western perspectives which take an idealised idea about technological progress, civilization through technology, and they apply it to a different context. And in fact, the Arab Spring was, growing over a period of time in various ways, in different parts of the region. And some of those activists were working online, but some of them were working offline. So I think we need to grow our self-awareness really about those technologies, while also embracing the possibilities that they bring.
Other thoughts on this dilemma around technology?
Well, I think the value question is an interesting one as well for people in businesses. What are your own values and how do they match with the organisation? And then we have to be honest, in some areas, and maybe not in the UK, and that's actually not in some of the people who look for work somewhere else on the globe, that values are the first question that they have. It's about, how do I look into my basic needs, and then how do we define these dialogues between these very different views of the world. And I think, kind of business and leadership and some of the, ethics behind that, and experts in the audience, my colleagues, can provide these ideas, how we even bridge where we think much more on the risk, some's not a risk. And I think that's a challenge that will come forward. And then if you then have big conglomerates, that means kind of classic questions. It's interesting how you go back. They're on stakeholder questions. They have been acute 50 years ago, but probably ignored to some extent, and now they come much more to the fore. So how do we deal with these dilemmas that we have and the choices where we might have no good choice or various good choices? I think that's very important.
Ali, Doug, anything?
Yes, so I think many of the potential solutions for climate change or helping communities within climate change are engineering or technological solutions. So, for example, soot in the atmosphere is a warming agent. So, if you have a lot of smoke from biofuel burning or domestic cooking stoves, there's a lot of emissions of that from India, for example, then not only are you affecting the air quality, but you're also producing a warming influence on climate. So, one of the suggestions is that you work and you go in and impose a technological solution from developed in the Western world on those communities, which ultimately will only get you so far because those are developed sometimes without the understanding of the communities in which they will be used. And so what's going to be really important over the next 90 years, and it's starting to happen now, is to work with the communities that you are actually wanting to influence. So a lot of work in terms of agriculture and rainfall prediction and insurance with African communities, for example, to reduce the vulnerability there. But we can only do that by understanding how they would use our weather forecast, for example. So it's that kind of co-development of technology where I think it's really exciting.
Well, I think that this is a really serious question, right? I think that the ethical issues that we're facing are enormous. And this is a role that universities need to step up to. No one else is really going to do it. It's exactly right that we have the technology is way ahead of what we think it is, right? So, as I said, the electrodes in people's brains. We already do lots of things. We could, in principle, be scanning all of your brains while you're sitting there surreptitiously using there's some new technology using light. So there's all kinds of things that are in principle are possible now. And I imagine they would be done if there was a buck to be made out of it. At the moment, nobody's very interested in scanning your brains, but it might change. But I do think this is a really serious issue. And one of the things that has struck me is that a lot of these discussions, ethical discussions that come up, my relationship with the business school gets me involved in some of them. They're usually about current problems, right? So there's a current issue, and we're trying to come up with a set of strategies to address it, and we take on board what are the ethical challenges associated with dealing with this current problem. But what we really need is something that looks at the future and tries to anticipate the ethical issues that are going to come and bite us, because it's kind of too late by the time we've got the ethical problem to worry about. We really need to be able to anticipate things. And that's something that I think we're not doing a very good job of.
Well, I get worried enough about contactless payment than anything else. Well, we've got 10 minutes or so for questions, so let me open it up to all of you in the audience. There are microphones going around, so if I could ask you as a gentleman here with his hand straight up, wait for the microphone. If you could just let us know who you are, that'd be very helpful.
Hello, I'm Martin Calvin. I studied fine arts in the Middle Ages. I want to focus on the word "our" before research. So I think what you said is absolutely fascinating. But there's a presumption here that first of all there will be a Reading University, and second there will be a university. Why should there be either a Reading University or a university in the way we understand it in 90 years' time, in order to benefit all of your research areas?
Okay, so everything else is getting disrupted. Why won't higher education be? Naturally in your territory.
I'm happy to give it a go. We did a case study with a print media company back in my home country, where the assumption is that their printed newspapers is gone at some point. It was a long journey to understand that this is gone. They hang on to this paper thing, and then they went into the valley and they asked them what a newspaper is. And I think, we are at the stage, taking up what Doug says, we need to think today way ahead of the, let's call it a business, a research or educational model about what the contribution of the university is. And it's probably not providing some kind of certificate as a monopolistic structure. It's much deeper. And I think you might not need to go 90 years when you need to think about what the function, the purpose of that industry is, to then what could be certain scenarios is then what's our service to society really? That's coming very much to the fore and letting us do what we can do. What is our service to society in education? And how can we connect that much better? And I think we probably don't even have the questions at the moment.
But we are all obsessed with impact in the higher education area, presumably for this reason, to try and work out what the value is to the society that we offer.
Yes, but just one sentence. It's interesting if you look at leadership from a complexity point of view. Impact is basically a really important thing, but it makes the system more rigid. Well, actually, the context gets much more ambiguous and fluid. Now, we need the rigid answer. We're not so sure about the more flexible answer, if that makes sense.
Yep, interesting.
I'll take a stab at sort of not defending the status quo, but I think that one of the things that Reading does, which it does particularly well, is kind of on display here. So Reading is incredibly good at interdisciplinary work. We get people who work together well, and the university as an institution has been actually very effective at supporting these types of things. So for instance, it may seem bizarre, but actually the SIN works with the meteorology guys because the kind of algorithms that they develop, we steal. So there are, we're looking at, there you go, there's a kind of impact. But actually, you can't do this type of research without the community. So one of the things that a role that universities provide, which I don't really see easily being provided by other mechanisms, is the opportunity for a molecular scientist, a systems neuroscientist, computational models of the atmosphere, and people concerned with business leadership and communication to actually find an opportunity to engage with each other and actually spark off each other. And Reading is very good at making that happen. It might have something to do with our size, actually. I say there's no particular reason why other institutions aren't as effective at this. But I was trained at MIT. MIT is noted for lots of things, but it's not noted for its friendly collegial relationships between the departments. So I think there is a real important role.
Great. Okay. Time for a couple more questions. Who else would like to give in? Yes, gentleman in the middle. Yeah. And if you could say if your questions aimed at any of the panel in particular, or
no, it's a general one. You talked an awful lot about using imagination and creativity to come up with interesting new ideas. I'm just concerned when you look around and you look at sort of public debates in this country and in Western Europe and in the US, you can see an enormous amount of skepticism on the part of large members of the public about experts and expert opinion. And the more we come up with interesting and creative ideas, almost the more distant we become from many parts of the public. And there's an issue of trust. And maybe we need to be more creative and more imaginative, not just about the research that we do, but in the way that we communicate that research and the way that we speak about it and construct narratives around it, in order to be able to connect what we do with the genuine concerns that many people have in the societies that we seek to serve. So I just wonder if you've got any reflections on how we communicate more imaginatively.
Okay, so how do we communicate? How do you let people understand what we're doing?
Okay, I'll have a go at that. So one of the things that's changed dramatically since I was a PhD student here many years ago is the way that we communicate about climate change, and also the attention that there is on climate change. So a couple of weeks ago, some of you may have seen this, there was one of our scientists, Ed Hawkins, came up with a very simple idea of plotting the way that the global temperature has changed as a spiral, and seeing it spiral out from the midpoint as it got warmer over the past 250 years. He posted that on Twitter. It went viral and on Facebook as well, and crashed the servers in meteorology, which didn't go down terribly well, but we fixed them quickly, so that's, the university can handle that, that's fine. But that's one example of how it's changed so dramatically, which is a good thing in that we can get our research to a whole new set of places that we want to, and in different ways. And actually, I think social media is quite a good way of engaging with new communities. It also means you have to be very careful of how you use those things, because once you put something out there, it's gone, and you have no control over what happens to it. So it's a really interesting time to be figuring out, communicating about some of these really big challenges. But if we don't try and don't keep trying, then there's very little point in sitting here and doing the research if nobody knows about it.
Most of the research I've seen says actually people do like and respect independent expertise, including academic expertise, and they're getting more estranged from elites, however you want to define elites, but that's probably a much bigger conversation. Have we got one final question we've got time for? Anybody burning to come in? A quick round? Yes. Final question, I'm afraid, because we're out of time.
My question is mainly about climate change and the economy. I was wondering, at the moment, clearly a lot of climate change development is hindered by the government saying that we need to keep the economy running within certain margins. And I was wondering whether you think there would ever be a tipping point where policy would then go in favour of environmental change, and whether technology will start to develop quicker because of the impact of climate change versus the impact that is having on the economy.
Ellie, and then maybe Bert might have a little bit.
Okay, so will there be a tipping point at which so the green economy starts to kick in? That's a really good question. We had a speaker from MIT, in fact, a couple of weeks ago, Susan Solomon, who was involved in discovering the chemistry behind how chlorofluorocarbons affect ozone, make the ozone hole. And we were talking about similarities and differences between what happens with Montreal Protocol, which was very successful in banning those gases very quickly, and the climate change issue today. And the key differences that we came up with were, first of all, that was a very small industry at the time, so there were only a few companies that made those, whereas climate change, greenhouse gases, for example, emitted everywhere by all sorts of things, so it's much harder to get industry in a coherent way to work together. Interestingly, the reduction in those gases being released actually predated the protocol, because there was a very good example of communication whereby they told the public that just by switching, in America, by switching from spray can deodorants to roll-on deodorants, you could reduce drastically the emissions of these gases. And the public did that before the protocol came into force. And I didn't know that until a couple of weeks ago, and I think that's absolutely fascinating. And what we'd like to sort of explore over the next few years is we probably are seeing that in terms of climate change, whereby public and local initiatives are starting, and at what point does that gain momentum and affect the wider political environment? I think that would be fascinating.
I just, I connect to the two questions beforehand, and I think the function of a university actually sits there to provide what I would call a hub to make these dialogues happen. And then going to skepticism and actually have courage and confidence to go out there. And I think often, we're on the back foot, like skepticism about results, and is it important? And I think, it would be nice to see the next 90 years that in these debates and other debates, that we actually go out there and say we're a real confident and courageous player in these debates, and actually we can, because we're quasi-neutral, facilitate these debates to have that open dialogue and make some of these better. And there's a bit of interesting, that they all look, they're experts, and well, actually we need to be probably more confident about being expert and understand our function to create this. And we try that, through bringing consortium organizations together for our leadership center, and we go through grillings, why on earth do we need to work with you? But that's then the courage to say, yes, that's really interesting because we have a hub function. And I think that would be, in addition to the content, a really interesting function that university with much more courage could do. That kind of thought was it?
Well, I just want to amplify what Ben just said. I think that there's a lot of information that's relevant to whether or not policy is going to get shifted. The debate around climate change and global warming has been highly politicized, and there's a need to be able to get expertise into the discussion in interesting ways. And I think one of the things that I'm just going to point to, that's something that Reading has been involved in through Reading Malaysia, is there was a study recently that looked at the incidence of dementia in urban centers and showed that in fact there's been a huge shift from vascular dementia to non-vascular dementias that's linked directly to the urbanization of the population. So 50 years ago in Malaysia, there wasn't much of it, and it was vascular dementia, and now it's widespread, and it's all in urban centers. So there's an impact that population movement has in ways that are unanticipated, I would just say that. And it's important that we be able to communicate that, because those, it seems to me, to be the kinds of information that are likely to push policy more than saying, yes, I believe in climate change, as another hand in the air, right? So that's important.
Thanks very much indeed. Okay, that's all we've got time for. Just before David comes back to close the event, we've got a film to play, but we all have to leave the stage so we're not in the way of you seeing it. But as we all leave the stage, can I ask you please to thank the panel once again.
Imagine having the power to change the world, to improve the environment around you for generations to come, to create a legacy. Over 90 years, we've always challenged convention, leading world-renowned research and making life-changing discoveries. We've built a thriving global community who share our ambitions and drive. We connect people and ideas. Imagine if together we transformed the lives of the 800 million people who are starving in the world. Imagine if together we're able to take on the destructive impact of climate change. Imagine if together we helped solve the global challenges of heart disease, mental health, and dementia. Our groundbreaking research already shapes the future for individuals and communities, for businesses and policymakers in outer space and the deepest of oceans. So join us in pioneering new research, inspiring the most creative minds, shaping the citizens of today and leaders of tomorrow. You do have the power to change the world. Together, we can make it happen. Let's dare to imagine.
Friends, colleagues, one of the privileges of my job is the endless succession of really interesting events that I get to attend. But tonight has been a real cracker. The content of what we heard round the panel was inspiring and stimulating, but also I think the illustration of the great strength of this university, as many panelists commented on, that ability to cross boundaries, to work together, and to think about things in very, very different ways. So what a great launch to our campaign. And I think this is the beginning of what will be a very exciting era ahead for the university. Delighted, of course, that Richard and the panelists gave such an interesting overview and perspective. So perhaps once again, you would show your appreciation. I hope that you found tonight's event interesting and inspirational, and I'll check what the brain scanning results tell me at the end of all of that. The work that we are doing is more important today than it's ever been before, and I do hope that it's inspired you to join with us to dare to imagine. Thank you once again for being part of this launch event, and please now join us for drinks and canopies in the reception. Thank you very much.